He slid the box across the table like he was closing a business deal, not confessing to an affair. 52 carats of Burmese pigeon blood ruby, set in a ring so rare that fewer than 6 people on Earth had ever been allowed to touch the stone before it was cut. My husband looked at the woman wearing it, not at me, and said the words that were supposed to end my marriage quietly. I want you to have something that actually matches what you deserve. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that the ring on her finger had never left my family's hands. Every gram of gold, every facet, every signature on that appraisal certificate ran back to a company with my name buried 3 layers deep in the ownership structure. He thought he was buying her a fantasy. He was actually handing her a subpoena. If you're new here, stay through to the end, because the moment she walked into that vault to have the ring authenticated is the moment her entire life quietly detonated. My name is Vivienne. For 11 years, the people in my life knew me as a mid-level gemologist who worked long hours at a small appraisal office in Charlotte, someone who came home smelling faintly of polishing compound and spent her weekends restringing her grandmother's old pearls for practice. That was true, as far as it went. It just wasn't the whole truth. I want to be honest about that before anything else, because it would be easy to look at how this story ends and assume I orchestrated all of it. I didn't. I spent most of my adult life trying very hard not to use what I had. My husband, Daniel, and I met the ordinary way, at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, where he spent 40 minutes explaining a contracting dispute he just won for a client and never once asked me a single question about myself. I found that oddly charming at the time. He had this restless, hungry energy, the kind that made you think he was going somewhere, even if you weren't sure where. He was a mid-level real estate attorney back then, sharp, funny when he wanted to be, and completely unaware that the quiet woman across the table could have bought the restaurant we were sitting in without checking her bank balance first. I liked that he didn't know. That was the whole point. 9 years earlier, when I was 19, my grandfather sat me down in his study, the same room where he'd built Ashworth and Vane from a single pawn counter in 1962 into one of the most quietly powerful jewelry houses in the country, and told me something I never forgot. He said the moment people know what you're worth, they stop showing you who they actually are. He'd watched it happen to his own son, my Uncle Peter, whose first marriage collapsed within 18 months of the company going semi-public, once his wife realized exactly what she'd married into. My grandfather made me promise that if I ever wanted to know a man's real character, I would have to let him fall for someone who owned nothing. So when I met Daniel, I told him I was a gemologist. That much was true. I did not tell him that the company whose vault held some of the rarest uncut stones in North America was mine, inherited outright at 26 after my grandfather's passing, structured through 3 holding companies and a trust so airtight that even our own senior staff didn't know the ultimate owner's name. Only 4 people alive knew the truth. My attorney, my chief financial officer, my grandmother, and, eventually, me watching my own marriage from the inside like a stranger pressing her face against the glass. For the first 4 years, I believed I'd found something real. Daniel drove 2 hours through a snowstorm once because I mentioned, almost as a joke, that I missed the diner near my childhood home. He sat with me in a hospital waiting room the night my grandmother had a fall, and he didn't check his phone once. I remember thinking that was the moment I knew. Not because he did anything extraordinary. Because he stayed. The man I married rented a modest 2-bedroom in a decent but unremarkable part of town. He drove a used Audi he was still paying off. He built his career the hard way, deposition by deposition, promotion by promotion, and I loved watching him do it. But somewhere around year 5, something in him started to shift, the way a foundation shifts, so slowly you don't notice the cracks until the doors stop closing right. He made partner at 34. And partner, it turned out, came with a different kind of dinner table. Clients who owned yachts. Colleagues whose wives wore statement jewelry that Daniel, without realizing it, would sometimes glance at a little too long. He started asking me questions he'd never asked before. Why didn't I want a bigger house? Why did I still drive the same car I'd had since graduate school? Why, when his firm's biggest client invited us to a gala at a private club downtown, did I wear the same simple silver studs I always wore, instead of something that would, in his words, match the room? I told him the truth, in the only way I was allowed to. I said I didn't need to prove anything to a room full of strangers. He didn't understand that answer. He thought it meant I was small. He never once considered it might mean I was the only person in that entire ballroom who genuinely didn't need what everyone else in it was chasing. That was the beginning of the distance. Not one argument, not one betrayal. Just a slow erosion, the kind where a person starts explaining you to others with an apologetic tilt in their voice, the way you'd explain a hobby that never quite paid off. I met Bianca Reyes for the first time at that same gala, though I didn't think much of her that night. She was 29, magnetic in the specific, curated way of someone who had built an entire personal brand around being seen, an event planner with 80,000 followers and a talent for making every room she entered feel like it existed for her benefit. She worked for the same firm's biggest client, coordinating high-profile events, which meant she and Daniel crossed paths constantly over the following year. I noticed him mention her name more than the average colleague warranted, always wrapped in some professional justification. She's sharp. She gets things done. She actually understands what clients want. I want to pause here, because there's something you should know that I didn't find out until much later. Bianca hadn't simply met Daniel by chance and been swept up by his charm. She had, for the better part of 2 years, been quietly building relationships with men 1 or 2 rungs below true wealth, the ambitious ones, the ones close enough to money to smell it but not close enough to own it outright. Her theory, which she'd apparently workshopped in private messages with a close friend that would later surface in a very different context, was that a man on the rise was more valuable long-term than a man who'd already arrived, because a man on the rise still had something to prove, and a woman standing beside him at the right moment could shape exactly what that was. Daniel, ambitious, recently made partner, married to a wife who refused to perform wealth she supposedly didn't have, was, in her private assessment, close to perfect. I didn't know any of this while it was happening. What I knew was smaller and quieter and, somehow, worse. I knew that my husband had started coming home later. I knew he'd started keeping his phone face down on the nightstand, a habit he'd never had in 9 years of marriage. I knew that when I asked about his day, his answers got shorter, and when I stopped asking, he seemed almost relieved. I told myself it was the promotion. New pressure, new expectations, a man trying to prove he belonged in a room he'd only recently been allowed into. I have spent most of my adult life being underestimated by people who didn't know who I was, and I think, without meaning to, I extended my husband the same patience I extended everyone else. I gave him room to become someone I didn't fully recognize, because some part of me was still waiting for the man who drove through a snowstorm to come back. He didn't come back. He went further. 14 months ago, Daniel began what he apparently told colleagues was networking with Bianca outside of work hours. Dinners that started as professional debriefs and stretched into 2, then 3 hours. A weekend conference in Miami that somehow required his presence despite having nothing to do with his actual caseload. I found out about most of this only in hindsight, piecing together a timeline the way you reconstruct a fire after the smoke clears, looking for where it actually started. What I want you to understand is that I am not telling you this story because I was blindsided by an affair. Plenty of people are, and there's no shame in that. I'm telling you this story because of what happened after Daniel decided that the woman worth reinventing his life for deserved a ring that would announce it to the entire world. And because of what he had absolutely no idea he was walking into when he chose where to buy it. He came to me on a Tuesday evening in March. Not with an apology. With paperwork. He sat across from me at the kitchen table we'd eaten breakfast at for 9 years and told me, in the calm, rehearsed tone of a man who has practiced a speech in his car, that he'd fallen in love with someone else, that he'd already spoken to a lawyer, that he wanted this handled quickly and without, in his exact words, unnecessary drama. I asked him if he loved her. He said yes, and then, almost as an afterthought, added that he was planning to propose. I remember sitting very still, the way you sit still when you're trying to figure out whether the ground beneath you is actually shaking or if it's just you. Then he told me about the ring. He said it with a strange kind of pride, the way men sometimes do when they've convinced themselves that the size of a gesture is proof of the size of a feeling. He'd been saving, quietly, for over a year. He'd consulted a broker. He'd found something extraordinary, a 52-carat pigeon blood ruby, one of the rarest gemstones to surface on the private market in a decade, currently held for private viewing at a boutique acquisitions house downtown. $50 million. He said the number like it was a trophy he expected me to admire on his behalf. I asked him which house. He told me. Ashworth and Vane Private Collections. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I certainly did. My husband was about to spend $50 million proposing to another woman with a stone that belonged, in every legal and practical sense, to me. He had no idea. Ashworth and Vane's public-facing acquisitions division operated under a separate brand entirely, Marchetti Rare Stones, specifically so that clients dealing in 8- and 9-figure private sales never had to interact with the family name attached to the parent company. It was a firewall my grandfather had built decades earlier, designed to protect the family from exactly the kind of exposure that comes with being visibly, obviously wealthy. I had walked past that exact showroom 100 times without setting foot inside, because I never needed to. I owned the walls it stood in. I didn't tell Daniel any of this. I looked at him across the table, this man I had loved fully and honestly for 9 years, and I said only 2 words. Good luck. He looked confused, like he'd expected tears, or fury, or begging. He got none of it. What he got instead was a silence that unsettled him far more than any of those reactions would have, though he wouldn't understand why for another 6 weeks. That night, after he left to stay somewhere I didn't ask about, I sat alone in the house we'd built together and made exactly 1 phone call. Not to my lawyer. Not to a friend. To Marguerite Delacroix, my company's chief compliance officer, the second of the 4 people alive who knew the truth about who I was. I told her a ruby matching a very specific description was about to move through a private acquisition, and that I wanted every stage of that transaction documented, quietly, without alerting the acquisitions team to why. She didn't ask me to explain. In 11 years running compliance for a family that guarded its privacy like a vault door, Marguerite had learned not to ask questions she didn't strictly need answered. She simply said, understood, and I believed her, because she had never once given me a reason not to. What I didn't tell her, because I didn't fully understand it myself yet, was that I wasn't doing this for revenge. Not at first. I was doing it because some small, stubborn part of me still needed to see it happen with my own eyes before I let myself believe it was real. 6 weeks passed. Daniel moved into a corporate apartment his firm kept for visiting partners. We spoke only through lawyers, brief, clipped exchanges about accounts and furniture and a house that suddenly felt too large for one person. I threw myself into work, into the parts of my life that had always been mine before Daniel and would remain mine long after him, and I waited. Bianca, meanwhile, was living the version of her life she'd spent 2 years quietly engineering. She posted, in careful, tasteful increments designed to look accidental, photos of dinners at restaurants that didn't list prices, weekend trips to coastal towns, a life gradually reshaping itself around a man who was, in her audience's eyes, an up-and-coming attorney sweeping her off her feet. What her followers didn't see, what almost no one saw, was the private message she sent a friend 3 weeks before the proposal, one that Marguerite's team would later recover as part of an entirely unrelated authentication review. In it, Bianca wrote that Daniel was finally starting to think bigger, and that once the ring happened, she planned to help him see what he actually deserves out of that firm. She wasn't just planning a wedding. She was planning a total reconstruction of my husband's ambitions, with herself positioned at the center of it. I want to be fair to her, even now, even knowing everything I know. I don't think Bianca set out to hurt anyone the way a cartoon villain might. I think she genuinely believed she was claiming something she'd earned through patience and strategy, the way some people believe a promotion is owed to them because they showed up early for 2 years running. What she never once considered was that the empire she was maneuvering her way toward the edge of had a gravity field she didn't understand, and that gravity field was about to pull her directly into its center. The proposal happened on a Friday evening in early May, at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the river, the kind of place that requires a reservation 6 weeks out and doesn't print prices on the dessert menu. I know this only because it became, very quickly, one of the most discussed 30-second video clips on the internet that entire summer. Daniel got down on one knee in front of roughly 40 strangers and a table of Bianca's closest friends, who, it turned out later, had been quietly notified in advance and positioned with their phones ready. He opened the box. The ruby caught the rooftop's string lights in a way that made 3 separate people gasp audibly, according to the video, which would go on to be viewed nearly 60 million times. Bianca said yes, before he'd even finished the sentence, her hands shaking, her friends cheering, the whole scene engineered for maximum, undeniable spectacle. What none of them knew, standing on that rooftop celebrating what they believed was the beginning of a new life, was that the ring's full custody chain, every transfer, every appraisal signature, every certificate of authenticity, had already been quietly flagged for internal review the moment it left the Marchetti showroom floor. Not because anything about the sale itself was improper. Because I had asked for eyes on it, and once compliance starts watching a stone that valuable, they don't stop watching until it's fully accounted for. The insurance requirement came 11 days later, and this is where everything changed. Any gemstone insured above $10 million requires a secondary, independent authentication, a formality most people never think twice about. Bianca's insurance broker, working through Daniel's firm's corporate benefits contact, scheduled that authentication at the only facility in the region licensed to formally certify a stone of that caliber and provenance. Ashworth and Vane's private vault, the actual mother company, not the boutique-facing brand she'd purchased it through. She walked in on a Tuesday morning wearing the ring on her finger like it already belonged to her, which, in every legal sense, it now did. What she didn't know was that she was walking directly into the one room on Earth where her fiancé's soon-to-be ex-wife's name appeared on the ownership documentation, not as a curiosity, not as a rumor, but as the majority shareholder listed on the very authentication certificate she was about to receive. I wasn't there that morning. I didn't need to be. Marguerite called me 40 minutes after Bianca left the building, and her voice had a careful, controlled quality I'd only heard from her twice before in 11 years of working together. She told me that during the standard authentication process, one of our senior gemologists, a woman named Odalise who had trained under my grandfather personally and had absolutely no idea who I was married to, had pulled the stone's full provenance file as required by protocol. That file included the original acquisition record from 6 weeks earlier, and buried in the transfer documentation, standard practice for any sale above $20 million, was a compliance notation requiring executive sign-off. My sign-off. My legal name, in full, printed clearly at the bottom of a document that had passed across my desk without me even registering the buyer's name at the time, because I approved dozens of these a month and rarely read past the dollar figure and the security clearance. Odalise, professional and utterly unaware of the personal earthquake she was about to trigger, had simply done her job. She cross-referenced the certificate, confirmed the chain of custody, and, following standard procedure for high-value authentications, mentioned to Bianca that the stone's final executive approval had come directly from the company's principal shareholder. Bianca asked, casually, who that was. Odalise told her. Marguerite said there was a long silence on the recording from the vault's internal security system before Bianca asked her to repeat the name. I want you to imagine that moment, because I've imagined it more times than I'd like to admit. A woman standing in a private vault, wearing a $50 million ring on her finger, being told that the man she'd just gotten engaged to had unknowingly purchased that ring from the company owned, entirely and legally, by his own wife. Not his ex-wife. Not yet. The divorce wasn't final. On paper, at the exact moment Odalise said my name out loud, Daniel was still legally married to me. According to the vault's internal log, Bianca left the building 11 minutes later without completing the final paperwork. She called Daniel from her car. I know what was said in that call only because Daniel, in one of the more remarkable displays of poor judgment I witnessed throughout this entire ordeal, called me 20 minutes later, apparently under the impression that I would somehow help him make sense of what had just happened. He was frantic in a way I had genuinely never heard from him before, not even during his most stressful trial weeks. He asked me, without any preamble, whether I had anything to do with a company called Ashworth and Vane. I told him the truth. I said I'd owned it outright since I was 26 years old. There was a silence on that call longer than any silence we'd had in 9 years of marriage. Then he asked the question I think mattered most to him in that moment, more than the affair, more than the ring, more than any of it. He asked how much the company was worth. I told him. Just over $2.3 billion, before this year's acquisitions were finalized. He didn't say anything for a long time after that. And in that silence, I understood something about my husband that I think I'd always known but had never let myself fully admit. He wasn't shocked that I'd hidden something this significant from him for 9 years. He was calculating what he'd just lost. The days that followed unfolded the way I imagine most public unravelings do, messily, publicly, and with far more attention than any of us actually wanted. Someone on Bianca's own team, possibly Bianca herself in a moment of panic, leaked a version of the story to a gossip account with close to 2 million followers. The framing, predictably, painted me as some kind of vindictive heiress who had orchestrated an elaborate trap, letting my husband walk directly into a $50 million humiliation for the pleasure of watching it happen. I understand why that version of the story was more interesting. It certainly generated more engagement than the truth, which was quieter and far less flattering to everyone involved except, perhaps, me. The truth was that I hadn't set a trap. I had simply continued living my life honestly while 2 other people built an entire future on assumptions neither of them had bothered to verify. Daniel's law firm placed him on quiet administrative leave less than a week later, not because of the affair itself, which was, frankly, none of their business, but because internal counsel determined that his now very public entanglement with the ownership structure of a client-adjacent company created what they termed an irreconcilable conflict of interest. Marchetti Rare Stones, it turned out, had handled 3 separate transactions for clients of Daniel's firm over the preceding 2 years. Once the connection to Ashworth and Vane became public, every one of those deals came under scrutiny, and Daniel's name, however tangentially, sat at the center of all of it. Bianca's engagement, unsurprisingly, ended within 9 days of the vault incident. She returned the ring, according to court filings that would surface months later during an unrelated contract dispute, not out of any sense of decency, but because her legal team advised her that keeping a $50 million gift purchased under what could be characterized as fraudulent marital circumstances exposed her to significant liability. She didn't hand it back quietly. She sold her side of the story to 2 separate outlets first, framing herself as an unwitting victim caught between a deceptive husband and a scheming heiress who'd apparently been testing her all along. I never gave a single interview. I didn't need to. The provenance documents, the compliance logs, the internal vault recordings, all of it existed independently of anything I said, and all of it told a version of events considerably less dramatic than the one circulating online. I hadn't planted anything. I hadn't lured anyone into a vault. A ring worth that much money simply cannot be insured without independent authentication, and I do not control which employee happens to be on duty the day a routine certificate gets pulled. What I did control, and what I thought about carefully in the weeks that followed, was what I chose to do with everything Marguerite's review had uncovered, because the authentication process hadn't just revealed my name. It had revealed the full financial shape of what Daniel and Bianca had actually built together over the preceding year, and some of it went considerably further than a $50 million ring. Marguerite's compliance file, the same one that had flagged the ring's provenance, also contained records from an unrelated internal audit our firm had been quietly running for almost a year, long before Daniel and Bianca ever crossed paths. That audit centered on a mid-tier acquisitions broker named Julian Voss, a man Bianca had known for years before she ever met my husband, back when she worked event coordination for his firm's client dinners. Voss had spent the better part of 2 years cultivating relationships with people adjacent to major private wealth, not for romance, but for information, quietly gathering intelligence on which families held which assets, which companies were undervalued on paper, which heirs were disengaged from day-to-day operations and therefore vulnerable to a well-timed acquisition offer. Bianca, it turned out, had been one of his most useful sources for over a year, feeding him small, seemingly harmless details about the wealthy clients she coordinated events for, in exchange for a modest but steady consulting fee routed through an intermediary. When she started dating Daniel, a rising attorney at a firm with deep ties to exactly the kind of clientele Voss was interested in, she mentioned it to him almost in passing. Voss, methodical and patient, told her to keep the relationship going and to pay close attention to anything that came up involving major asset transfers. Neither of them had any idea that the biggest asset transfer either of them would ever touch was sitting quietly in my own name the entire time. When the ring's provenance became public and my ownership of Ashworth and Vane surfaced, Voss recognized an opportunity Bianca never saw coming. He reached out to 2 of my company's minority shareholders directly, using the public scandal as leverage, suggesting that a founder embroiled in personal chaos, a public divorce, a viral engagement disaster, an ex-husband's professional collapse, represented a company whose leadership stability was, in his careful phrasing, worth examining. He proposed a minority buyout at a valuation conveniently low enough to benefit him significantly if he could convince even one or two shareholders to sell. I found out about this the way I found out about most things that year, through Marguerite, sitting across from me in my office with a folder she clearly didn't enjoy handing over. I want to tell you that I felt afraid in that moment, watching a stranger try to use the wreckage of my marriage as an entry point into my grandfather's company. I didn't. I felt something closer to clarity. I had spent 9 years being underestimated by the one person who was supposed to know me best. I was not about to let a man I'd never met make the same mistake at a much higher cost. I called an emergency meeting of the full board within 4 days, something Ashworth and Vane hadn't done in over a decade. I stood in front of 11 people who had known me for years as a careful, deliberate leader who rarely raised her voice in a boardroom, and I told them, plainly, everything that had happened. My marriage. The ring. Voss. All of it. I told them I wasn't asking for sympathy. I was asking them to understand exactly what kind of person was currently trying to use a personal scandal to acquire influence over a company that had taken 60 years to build. Then I laid out the documentation. Marguerite walked the board through Voss's outreach, the timeline of his relationship with Bianca, the pattern of information gathering that stretched back nearly 2 years, and the specific valuation numbers he'd quietly proposed to 2 shareholders who, credit to them, had brought the offer to compliance themselves rather than entertaining it privately. The board didn't need much convincing. They voted unanimously to formalize a shareholder protection clause my grandfather had drafted decades earlier but never activated, one that required unanimous board approval for any minority stake sale exceeding a certain threshold during a period of active litigation or public controversy involving majority ownership. It closed the door Voss had been trying to walk through, cleanly and permanently. I never spoke to Voss directly. I didn't need to. Once the clause passed, his outreach simply stopped, the way water stops flowing once you shut the valve. Bianca, for her part, discovered the consequences of her arrangement with Voss the hard way. When the story of his attempted acquisition surfaced through an unrelated business journal investigating his broader pattern of activity, her name appeared in the reporting, not as a mastermind, but as what one source called an unwitting conduit, a description she reportedly found more humiliating than being called anything worse. The events company she worked for quietly let her contract lapse. The friends who'd cheered at that rooftop proposal grew noticeably quieter online. She didn't lose everything because I decided to punish her. She lost the version of her future she'd built on information she never should have been trading in the first place, and when that foundation gave way, there wasn't much left standing beneath it. Daniel and I finalized our divorce 4 months later, in a conference room that felt smaller than the 9 years we were dividing up deserved. He didn't fight me on the settlement terms, mostly because his own legal team advised him that contesting anything publicly would only invite more scrutiny into his professional conduct. He received exactly what he was entitled to from our shared life together, our joint accounts, half the equity in the house, nothing more. He received absolutely nothing from Ashworth and Vane, because there was nothing to receive. The company had never been part of our shared life. It had only ever been mine, protected by a trust structure my grandfather built before Daniel and I had even met. We had one final conversation, in the parking lot outside the courthouse, standing several feet apart in a way that felt strange after 9 years of standing close. He asked me, quietly, whether I had known all along that this was how it would end, whether some part of me had been waiting for him to fail so I could watch it happen from a position he never saw coming. I told him no. I told him I had spent 9 years hoping he'd never have a reason to find out at all, because the version of him I fell in love with never needed to know what I was worth to know that I was worth staying for. I told him money hadn't made him careless. It had simply given him permission to stop hiding what he was already becoming. I said it without anger, because by then, the anger had mostly burned itself out and left something quieter behind, something closer to grief for the man I used to think he was. He didn't have a response to that. He got in his car and drove away, and I stood in that parking lot for a long moment, feeling the particular kind of stillness that comes after something ends, not with an explosion, but with the simple absence of a person who used to be there. I kept the house. I still go back to the small appraisal desk at the Charlotte office 2 days a week, not because I need to, but because that work, quiet, precise, unglamorous, is where I remember who I actually am underneath everything my grandfather built. Ashworth and Vane closed the following fiscal year at just over $2.6 billion in valuation, its strongest 12 months in company history, driven in no small part by a wave of public interest that arrived through the strangest possible door. I established something new that year, too, a foundation funded through company earnings, dedicated to financial literacy programs for young women entering relationships and careers without family wealth to fall back on, teaching the kind of quiet, unglamorous vigilance my grandfather once taught me, not out of suspicion, but out of self-respect. I named it after my grandmother, who'd spent 60 years married to a man whose fortune she never once let define her. One evening last spring, I stood in the private vault where Bianca had once learned my name from a stranger, checking a new acquisition alongside Odalise, who still, to this day, has no idea the role she unknowingly played in the unraveling of my marriage. She held up a modest, unremarkable stone, nothing close to $50 million, and asked what I thought of it. I turned it over in my hands the way my grandfather taught me, looking past the surface for whatever flaws or clarity the light might reveal underneath. I told her it was honest. Nothing hidden in it, nothing trying to be something it wasn't. Just exactly what it appeared to be, all the way through. And maybe that's the part of this story worth sitting with longer than the ring, longer than the number on the valuation screen, or the video that 60 million strangers watched without knowing a single true thing about the people in it. I didn't lose my marriage the night Daniel opened that box on a rooftop. I lost it slowly, across years of small moments when he started needing an audience more than he needed me, and I told myself it was ambition instead of naming it for what it actually was. The most powerful thing I did in this entire story wasn't watching a $50 million ring expose a lie neither of them saw coming. It was choosing not to become someone who needed a boardroom or a vault or a viral video to know exactly who I was. I already knew. I'd known the whole time. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, stay close, because the next story might be the one that changes how you see everything you thought you already understood about the people closest to you.